This is Ancient Political Philosophy on Friday, November 6th, 2020. We're talking about Book 2 of Aristotle's Politics. And on Monday, November 9th, we will turn to Book 3 of Aristotle's Politics. Two big issues. Well, three big issues. How's this? Are articulated in Book 2. One is since in Book 1 we discovered that the polis, the nature of the polis and the political association, and Book 2 introduces the concept of the constitution or the regime or the polity. As we discussed in the a couple of weeks ago when we turned to the ethics, and I passed out that sheet on key terms in Greek political thought, this concept of the politeia, which, remember, is the Greek name for the republic. That's what the name of the republic actually is. And there's some validity to that, as you'll see when we finish with Book 3 and 4 of the Politics. But the analogy sometimes when I'm teaching American government or this material is that in psychology, the person is the concrete thing, personality is the abstraction that both classifies and distinguishes types of personality. So every person has a personality, and what psychological science does, at least certain kinds of psychological science, classifies people according into types of personality. The elements of personality are all the same in everybody, depending on which psychologist you're talking about, whether it's Freud or Jung or Plato for that matter. But everyone has a personality, and there are types of personality. And what locating the type of personality is, and by the way, let's repeat what I just said. And the elements of personality are the same in every human being. But what distinguishes each person from each person is the type of personality they have, which is like in Freudian psychology, superego, id, ego, or in Jungian psychology, a little more complex things like persona, archetypes, collective unconscious, etc. The type of personality does two things. It reveals how you're different from another person, and it also explains why you do the magic that you do that voodoo that you do so well, from Cole Porter. So the science of psychology takes the concrete thing called a person and then abstracts from, or creates an abstraction called personality, which explains how that person is that person and is different from other persons. That analogy is pretty apt in terms of what Aristotle, and Plato for that matter, as we saw in the Republic, what Aristotle is doing in the Politics. And to some degree, he begins this process, if you remember, in the Ethics, especially the book on friendship, the two books on friendship, which also contains a discussion of the types of regime. Here is the fuller discussion of that issue. And so Book 2, after establishing the nature of the polis, that is to say the political community, the nation, the state, whatever the city, polis, the actual translation is, but again, America would be our polis, the United States of America is our polis, the United Kingdom would be the polis of the Britons. We're not sure what polis South Carolina is in yet. We're still working on that after 240 years. But at any rate, so Book 2 introduces the concept of kinds of what a polity is, a constitution is, and a regime. Lord's translation has a preference for the translating polity as regime, and other translations translate polity as constitution. And the word polity in English actually is the English transliteration almost, in the same way that politics is the English version of the Greek word politike. Ethics is the Greek word of the is the English equivalent of the Greek word ethike. Again, it became politike, politica, politics. Ethike, ethica in Latin, ethics, so forth. So polity is the phenomenon that that is introduced in Book 2 and elaborated with this framework in Book 3 and put to practical use in Book 4, as you'll see. All right, so that's the one thing. But then besides that, because it turns out that two other big issues are articulated, both of which turn out to be criticisms of Plato. Because once you talk about polities, constitutions, let's just confine ourselves to regimes then, for translating that word, the comprehensive political system of a nation. That's how I often define what Aristotle and Plato mean by regime, what the concept of constitution or regime means. And every country, every nation has a constitution or a regime or a polity. But it turns out there are kinds of polity, and as you'll see, the two other issues, let me just go through the notes. Since we saw in Book 1 that the political community, the polis, is an association, a having in common. And if you have a group of people that don't have anything in common, you don't have a polis, you don't have a city. Members of a city have to have, of a nation, of a state, have to have something in common. It is the kind of unity. Well, then the natural question is, how much unity? And as you'll see, this is why Plato is implicated, because Plato, that famous theoretician of politics that we met in last big book, well, actually the next to the last big book, since we just did the ethics. Socrates / Plato say, well, the political association unifies everything. Everything is brought within the political association. And as you're going to see, Aristotle says, no, that's not good. Now, it's interesting, by the way, because you could say, because remember how Aristotle defines nature, that what a thing is when its process of growth or birth is completed. So that is to say, all of its natural motions or potential for natural motions have been brought into activity, energeia, being at work, as according to Sachs's translation in the Ethics. And but here's an interesting question, which exists anyway, just on the basis of Book 1. So it turns out there are three kinds of human associations, three species in the genus association. There's the household association, unified and expressing primarily the two lowest needs of life, nutrition and reproduction. Then there's the village, which is the next association that grows out of the family, still probably linked through common descent, if not common kinship, simply common blood, which is the association in body of the household or family. They're members of the body. Because they eat together and they don't all sleep together, but I mean, but in the Republic they do. But that's the problem, as you're going to see for Aristotle. But nevertheless, here's an interesting thing. So the village is the next stage in human, the next association out of which that grows out of the family when the family gets to be too big. So it'd be like, I think, what Aristotle might call a tribe, or the sort of community where it's small enough that everyone's pretty much related, and that the chief of the tribe is like the father of the household, or if it's a matriarchy or whatever. But the polis, strictly speaking, is the association that comes into being either from the association of villages, and that means kinship, common descent from body, has been transcended with common unity in the political association, which is, as you'll see, an ideational, conceptual unity. But then, if the political association is a unity, how much should be unified? And as you saw in the Republic, Plato, Socrates say pretty much everything, and that's, as you're going to see, that's the beginning of the critique of Socratism or Platonism. The polis is a unity, but how much? Should the private erotic be eliminated or suppressed in the name of the public and thumatic? This is the first criticism of Plato. Aristotle is the great defender of the dignity, of the necessity of the household, of keeping this association. Note, by the way, that when the polis comes into being, here's why this is a good question. You could say, well, when you grow into an adult as a human being, you don't actually keep the stages of your prior elements of growth in your adult configuration. Well, some of us do, but you could say that once the oak tree doesn't contain within it the acorn. The acorn as a stage disappears as it grows into the oak tree. So you could say what Plato might have, Plato might have some support here. Once the city comes into being, you don't need these other prior, smaller, more bodily or animalistic associations. Why can't they all just disappear into the political association? Aristotle doesn't say much about the village. The village as an intermediate state doesn't seem to be preserved, but the household does have to be preserved, and that is a great difference between at least Plato in the Republic, Plato, Socrates in the Republic. The laws, as you'll see, Aristotle does take this up, and he does think the laws is better than the Republic, but it has to do about this preservation of the household. So the beginning of Aristotelian political science isn't just to reveal the nature of the polis, it's to argue that this prior association of the household should not disappear into, should not be absorbed into the unity of the polis. So in doing so, and by the way, let me go make my editorial comment. So Aristotle is the great defender of the dignity, the necessity of the preservation of the household, the private, the erotic. Americans and moderns like this. That's the part of Aristotle they prefer over Plato. But, as we saw on Wednesday and will continue today, in doing so, Aristotle departs from the Platonic ideal of the elimination of the differences between men and women, and the full institutional integration of women into the public life of the city. And Americans, moderns, don't like that. We glanced at this issue in Book 1 in our last discussion, and Aristotle advocates neither patriarchy nor feminism. When I teach this material in Gender and Politics, I actually coin, and I start that class off with a spectrum of alternatives on the question of male and female in political and social life. And I actually coin a term for him called domesticism or domesticist. Now, feminists tend to think that's baloney, that domesticism is just another form of patriarchy. But more about this later. We started this discussion, and we'll try to conclude it, because so Aristotle is both the defender of the private, the household, but also maintains some differences between men and women that don't seem to accord with our modern vision. The second issue, big issue, not unrelated to the first and overlapping with it, is the tension between theory and practice. You might say in the Ethics, Aristotle adumbrates this or sketches it out because he reveals that intellectual virtue has two kinds. Wisdom, which is contemplative or philosophic, sees the nature of the whole, and prudence or practical wisdom, practical judgment, which is the virtue of the citizen and of the ruler of a polis. So theory and practice seems to be a distinction which is inherent in philosophic grasp of human reality, in political philosophy. But as you're going to see, here's the issue then that distinction between theory and practice raises. Theory that becomes too detached from reality in front of one, or from the foundations of human nature, tends towards utopianism, an abstraction from circumstances or human nature, and eventually becomes tyrannical, according to Aristotle. This danger is implicit in political philosophy, I think, and I think Aristotle thinks. If Aristotle were alive today, he would argue that, like Plato, Phaleus, and Hippodamus, the three theoretical authors that he deals with, four, if you count Plato of the Republic and Plato of the Laws and Phaleus, well, more about the structure of Book 2, the way it reveals itself on this question later. He would argue that modern political philosophy and the politics that issue from it, from that philosophy, become idealized premises. That is to say, they become premises, philosophic premises, which are both rooted in and in some ways abstractions from human nature. And those two core abstractions that dominate modern political philosophy and modern politics are liberty, freedom, and equality. But Aristotle would say that these idealized philosophic premises conclude in dangerous extremes of liberty and in the form of existentialism, the last major development of modern thought, and equality, Marxism, neither of which the complexity of human nature can bear. Add to these philosophic political extremes the power of modern scientific technology, and Aristotle would suspect that the modern project is not going to end very well. Is he right? Well, we don't know. We're right in the middle of this experiment, you and I, and everyone alive today. So it's hard to say at this point if our end point is world state in Huxley's Brave New World, Aldous Huxley's great dystopian political science fiction novel, or the Orwellian nightmare of 1984. That's why it's still relevant to read these old guys, these old ancient authors. They may have something to teach us that we're blind to because of the nature of the philosophic assumptions of our political universe and the political playing out of those philosophic assumptions. Anyway, let's pull back and explore these themes, but meanwhile, some generalizations about our authors. Aristotle and Plato are the founders of political science in the sense that they formulate the core conceptual and analytical tools by which one understands and classifies political things. The core concept after the revelation of the nature of the political association is the politeia, the constitution regime, polity. And see my list of terms that we talked about. This obviously has a theoretical purpose to classify and explain the kinds of politics that polis, that's the plural of polis, polis is the polis' cities, do. But it has an important practical purpose. To see this, ask how we make things better in the world. And again, I kind of dealt with this issue in books 8 and 9 of the Politics, of the Republic. You can argue that by leaving them alone or trusting them to God, that's how things get better in the world. That human beings are so bad at this that every time we try to change and rule things in the world, we screw it up. That's the premise of tragedy, by the way. And that's why there's no happy ending. Now, but it's not the premise of the Bible, because the Bible and the Abrahamic view of the world holds that the world is in the hands of an omnipotent, omniscient, and guiding intelligence. And no, it's not Dr. Dunn. But according to the political philosophers, the tradition that we're examining, you can make the world better by understanding it, and that the human mind is capable of understanding, at least to the point of being able to make things better. For Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, humans have a unique power of reason, self-consciousness, which can be trained to see better and to improve our lives by seeing what and where we are, and what and where we might go or should become. For Aristotelian political science, the science of improving cities is guided by coughing up elements of breakfast in your esophagus. Aristotelian political science is guided by what is best, or at least better than what is in front of you. But it's also guided, as you'll see, by what are the limits of our ability to bring this about, inherent in the human condition. I think Socrates, Plato are weighing that in the Republic. After all, don't forget at the end of Book 7, to bring the perfect city into being, you have to persuade everyone over the age of 10 to leave the city and turn their children over to the philosophers. How's that working for you? Think that'll work? This is almost a matter of theoretical wisdom, as you'll see, or inherent in the situation in the city in front of us. In some ways, this is a matter of practical reason. And my point above was that in introducing Book 2 is he's weighing theoretical and practical wisdom in this book for reasons you'll see in a minute. It turns out there are different kinds of regimes and different kinds of political change. There's absolute big political change called revolutions, and then there's transitions. There is the moment in a city's life called founding. And then either there's development or decay and or revolution. So founding, development, improvement or decay, and ultimately revolution are the moments of political transition in a nation's life that he, as you'll see, will examine not only in this book and the rest of the Politics. Aristotle raises the question of theory and practice in Book 2 by looking at both theoretical regimes and speech, that is, the Republic, the Laws, and Phaeus. And Hippodamus, as you'll see, has an interesting discussion below. In blending gossip and philosophy in Aristotle's account of him. It's a strange part of Book 2 that I want to talk about later. And practical reason. And he looks at three real regimes, historical regimes that existed in actuality, Sparta, Crete, and Carthage. And you'll see that this becomes relevant in Book 3 and 4. So just to kind of give you a sense of where the Politics goes, after isolating the genus and species of the political community, defining its nature and the nature of the polis in Book 1. In Book 2, he introduces the concept of the polity or constitution or regime. In Book 3, he will fully develop the kinds of regimes, classifiable regimes. And then book 4 is really, as you're going to see, the most practical book of the politics, in which Aristotle puts his political science to work. I'll give you a hint of where this goes. Most real regimes in existence are either oligarchies where the wealthy rule or democracies where the many poor rule. And it turns out the polity, that regime, which is the least bad of the good, no, the least good of the good regimes, is the mean between two extremes of democracy and oligarchy. More about that later. Anyway, the critique of Plato. Plato's mistake is to over-unify the polis. Now, the polis is a unity, but how much of a unity should that be? And the essence of that, as he lays out, and the main criticism he makes in the first part of Book 2, is that not only is Plato's over-unifying of the polis, the regime, in other words, of complete unity, it destroys the polis. It turns out that it's not only bad practice, utopian practice, but it's bad theory. So Aristotle argues that even Plato's image of the perfect city is a bad model, because it's an over-unification. And it turns out this destroys the polis. The way that he actually explains that in Book 2 is he unifies the in eliminating the household and integrating it completely into the city. Aristotle destroys the city by turning it into a household. Now, as we saw, one of the reasons the household couldn't be the final institution that articulates human nature is because the authority of the father or parents absorbs the ability of the children, even as adults, to deliberate and choose on their own. And in a way, that's what he argues. If you're going to bring all the goods of sexual and economic life into the city, you're going to turn the city into Big Daddy. It's going to become totalitarian. Because if the city rules everything, it's going to rule everything, and you, in effect, have to expand the authority of the city over the aspects of life so much that you actually pervert the city, and tyranny's just around the road. But he also argues, the critique of Plato for destroying, is that actually it destroys love and destroys human happiness. And as you'll see, this does come back to the issue of women and men. This is because ultimately, to say we need the household, our psychological happiness, because he says, because Plato wants to make sure that people only love the city, so you take all the fathers and mothers and sons and daughters, and take all property, and everyone in the city says, this is mine, meaning this is ours. There's no mine, actually. In turning mine in every owning the same things and having the same wives and husbands and children, actually you turn mine into ours. And he argues that actually doesn't intensify love, it destroys love. And his argument is psychologically love has to begin with what's yours, and that's ultimately in the body, the erotic. So you have to, if you eliminate the erotic or the private erotic, you actually destroy people's capacity to love. In a way, what he's saying is, first you have to learn what psychological attachment and love is in the household. Then they have to love the city by in some ways transcending the household. But you can't jump right from the human psyche to the political without it being developed in the cocoon of the household. And as you're going to see, that means mothers. We need mothers, according to Aristotle. And it isn't just that you destroy the capacity for love. People need their own. He says this is part of what happiness is, and he reveals this in the Ethics, by the way. Some of the virtues require you to have something of your own, and that's partially your own money, your own friends, your own family. And so without your ownness, own life, in Newspeak in 1984, human beings can't be happy. And if you agree with me that neither Julia nor Winston appear to be happy until Big Brother destroyed their hearts and their minds. There has to be, here's what that means then. Human beings have to have their feet in two worlds. There's an eternal tension between the household and the city. But you can't eliminate that tension by destroying one element of it. The city has to strive for unity, not by destroying the private, but by education and public culture, and by finding an institutional balance of regimes. That last sentence is Book 4, and but by education and culture is Books 7 and 8, as you'll see. So let's go back to the issue of men and women that we started in our last discussion. Aristotle argues male and female are not like hairy and bald, as Socrates, Plato dismissed them in the Republic, but male and female in nature, not just the human species, but remember, and this is primarily Millennium. Yes, Aristotle. I don't know if Aristotle was aware of black widows and snakes that eat their children or husbands, but he's talking primarily about mammalian nature because we are mammals. We're not just animals. We're mammals. And his argument is that male and female do have a different function, different character, primarily distinguished by reproductive function, but that's just not some difference in body like fingernails or bald and hairy. Our reproductive differences actually have to do with the way identity is formed, and that the core relationship between mother and child, first in terms of birth, that is to say pregnancy and birth. I mean, we start out as we're not really part of our mother's bodies, but we're inside them. And that's a unique relationship. That can't be abstracted. Whatever else your relationship with your father is, you didn't come out of your father's body. And then ultimately nursing. So Aristotle argues that the reproductive differences between male and female isn't incidental or peripheral to human life. It's probably at the heart of human life. Now, you can disagree with this, but at least this is part of his talk. Now, generally speaking, in other mammalian species, males predominate over females, and there's a passivity to female nature in other which Aristotle argues may be part of human nature. But you're going to see that discussion is complex, and here's where translation becomes important. So, what about male and female in human life and politics? The analysis in Book 1, and this is a restatement of 2D above, there are three kinds, that is to say, of our discussion of the politics. Remember, in the household, there are three kinds of rule. Master, slave, parent, child, and husband, wife. The first two are superior over inferior. The first is permanent, and the second is temporary. Aristotle calls the rule of husband over wife political rule, which he defines political rule, and you'll see this will be borne out in Book 3. Political rule is rule of equal over equal. So Aristotle admits that in some core sense, male and female in human life, even though there may be an echo of animal life in larger nature, the fact is, in human nature, men and women are essentially equal. And that's what distinguishes political rule. Two things, substance and form. That means, in other words, if you have political rule over another human being, which you're essentially equal, you can't simply order them around. You can't simply command them as a master commands a slave, or even a parent commands a child. But remember, a parent commanding a child is devoted to having the child develop the sufficient reason not to need the parent's commands. So, in some ways, you have to remember that but then political rule exists when two beings are essentially equal. And that means you can't just boss them around or slap them around anymore. You've got to persuade them. The substance of political rule is persuasion and deliberation, shared deliberation. The form is institutional form, is signified by ruling and being ruled in turn, by election and terms. In other words, how do you know when you live in a regime that's political? Because just as our presidential election is determining or has determined, people don't hold office forever. People go up to office, exercise power according to limits and the definition of the office, and then return to the citizenry. So that means that the person who occupies office is temporary. Now, as you're going to see, that leads to the great question of men and women. And to remind you, in Book 1, he says that confusion in barbarian societies is that they equate women and slaves. Barbarian, and he's not just talking about conventionally between Greek and barbarian, although that's what barbaros means stranger in Greek, and that was my ex-wife's name, barbarian. No, just Barbara was her name. Never mind that. We won't go down that rabbit hole. Anyway, and that's why women have to be considered citizens. Aristotle doesn't simply affirm the patriarchy and the exclusion of women from politics in his world, in the larger life of the city. So here are the two questions, then, that come out of Aristotle's treatment of male and female in Book 1 and that bleed into the discussion of male and female and the private in Book 2. So why do husbands exercise a final authority over wives? Why don't husband and wife rule and be ruled in turn? Why don't they take turns being the boss? And I think Aristotle would argue in healthy marriages they do. And then the second question then, that seems to be a difference between Plato and Aristotle, is why should men stand both in the private and public realms while women over in the private? And this is how most readers understand Aristotle's teaching, although he's not particularly specific on this. And the answer is convention. Women's reason is not authoritative. Now here you need some translation. When he says this in discussion in Book 1, the Greek word is akuron. And this comes from the Greek word kurios, which is Lord. If those of you Christians, you know what Kyrie eleison, Lord have mercy, Christi eleison, Kyrie eleison, Lord have mercy, Christ have mercy, etc. So kurios is, and then the prefix means no or not, like typos means type, and atypical means non-typical. Tomein means to slice or cut in Greek, and atomein means not cuttable, which is why Democritus, the great materialist Greek philosopher, considered the fundamental unit of matter to be an atom, not cuttable. So akuros means not ruling. So Aristotle admits that some women may be smarter than some men, and maybe most women are smarter than most men. So why do husbands rule their wives? Why isn't there this ruling and ruling in turn? And he says it may be simply conventional, that that even if there's a fundamental partnership and equality between men and women, men just have a tendency to get in the driver's seat, and it's to kind of keep the peace or something like this. It may be, in other words, a distinction which convention has amplified, which is perhaps rooted partially in nature, but not completely in nature. There's a fuzziness about this. But then he does argue Mu and him with different virtues, that it's not just as Plato says that because women have the capacity to philosophize, that women should therefore be full rulers in the city and should be cut off from the private, just like men. And so, and then this is where the Book 2, that's where this issue that begins in Book 1 is completed in Book 2. The family must be preserved, as we saw. For political health, Plato over-unifies the city, as we saw, for human happiness and human virtue, and finally, psychological integrity. The capacity for love and being happy as a human being, one learns love first in the family, and primarily from one's mother. And then that becomes political love. So you could put this you can't simply generalize motherhood into parenthood. Motherhood and fatherhood are different modes of parenthood rooted in our natures. And Aristotle says it, without mothers, no humanity. Don't forget, in Brave New World, the greatest obscenity in 500 years in the future, when all babies are born decanted in factories, and men and women now do the same things, the greatest obscenity is mother. So on this question of the preservation of motherhood, as motherhood, rests the distinction, at least part of the distinction between Plato and Aristotle. But don't forget, women are not slaves, and they're not children. Women must be educated as citizens, that's books 7 and 8, as you'll see, and partially because they presumably participate in the dialogue of the city, partially because they in other words, where do citizens come from? They come from their mothers and fathers, to be sure. But it's in the household that Americans learn patriotism, you might say. In other words, but it's not just that. The capacity for patriotic love is grounded in Aristotle's, as we saw earlier in Book 2, is grounded in the love of the private, in one's own. And that means essentially it is mothers who are the ground of our psychological integrity and the potential for happiness and love. Now, fathers are also necessary, but that's why Aristotle's defense of the private is eventually a defense of motherhood. So, some concluding thoughts and on women in the institutional life of the city. Moreover, Book 2 argues that Plato's abolition of the family is bad for human happiness, integrity, and even the city itself. The family has to be preserved, and I just went over that actually. Happiness requires some enjoyment of the private, one's own, rooted not only in the political identity, which links you to all other citizens. It is a form of friendship, it is a form of unity. But there has to be some association in the body, in the erotic parts of the soul. And he actually says that if you try to make everyone love everyone equally, love becomes watery. It's a great phrase in Book 2. But then why should men stand in both, in the public and private realms, while women only in the private? So far as most readers, as I said above, understand this teaching, which seems to suggest that if women don't have full access to the institutional rule in society, that women as a class are subordinated to men as a class. In fact, this is my definition of feminism I use in my gender and politics class. What is feminism? The advocacy of a reordering of society so that one man doesn't have any more power over a woman in a dyadic relationship because of gender differences, and where men as a class don't have power over women as a class. But if you exclude women from the forms of institutional rule, don't you in fact subordinate women as a class to men as a class? Not just wives to husbands, but women in society to men in society. There may be something to this. So why does he defend this? Perhaps because having the full role of public citizen would force women to give up and relinquish the preference they have for their own children and husbands for the sake of the impersonal bonds of the city, therefore diluting the core of personal erotic love. Maybe that's one reason why women have less of a public presence or involvement. It could somehow dilute the capacity of the ruling institutions to feminize them. That seems to be Aristophanes' critique in his two great comedies where women come to rule, Lysistrata and the Assembly or Congresswomen. So where do women stand in Aristotle's city? They are citizens and should be included in the city's education, as you'll see the end of politics comes to. And they bear, along with men, to be sure, the city into the family. That is to say, I learned how to be patriotic from my mother, which means they not only bear and nurture the bodies, but also the souls of citizens. And moreover, the inner life of the family should be a shared soul. It should be rational and consultative. But the family and the city are healthier with women not being fully integrated into the city's public institutions. Here's Pavorty speaking. I'm not trying to defend Aristotle against the modern criticism that women are in some respects subordinated, and in the general sense men in his version of politics and family. But it's important to remember that Aristotle did not share the modern liberal preoccupation with equality, or freedom for that matter, and neither does Plato. How can we arrange, their political question is not, how can we arrange the city so that human potential of its members is not, how can we make every individual and class equal in political power, but rather, how can we arrange the city so that the human potential of its members can be actualized consistent with the realities of human nature, including gender distinctions, the common good, and human virtue. That's the political question for Aristotle, and for Plato for that matter, and I think for Cicero. Our political question, given the premises of our modern political philosophy, is how can we make everyone more equal and more free. There's no question that's part of the political question for Aristotle and Plato, but it's not the totality of it as it is for us. Therefore, we bring to these issues already a cave, as to use Plato's terminology in Book 7. And he would say that the full equalization of all people with power is a secondary, not unimportant, but secondary, if important at all. Secondary to giving women the vital and essential responsibility for bearing love and attachment into the human condition, and by not forcing them to bear the burden of being the anchor of the family, and by creating a venue where their unique female capacities could be best developed, made rational and linked to the larger life of the city. How is this relevant to us today? Aristotle may not appeal to moderns, either feminist or otherwise, and his teaching may not be implementable on the civic or institutional level because of the foundational prevalence in the modern dogma of human equality and freedom. But he might be useful in reminding us of what we may lose or neglect in moving to a world of homogeneous individuals in the scientifically centralized state whose connection to the world around them is solely the result of legal and psychological individual construction. So, it may be that the homogenization of human identity and its concentration in scientific centralized rule, maybe that's where human happiness lies, but maybe not. So, the last major question, theory, practice, and hippodamus. When you look at the structure of Book 2, you see a teeter-totter, a seesaw. When you see it not in terms of chapters and chapter numbers, but rather by who and what's being talked about. What you get is, in the first part, is 3 theoretical regimes. And then in the second part, 3 practical regimes. With this odd figure, hippodamus, being the fulcrum of the seesaw or teeter-totter. So if you're looking on the notes, so you get Plato's Republic first, Plato's Laws second, Phallius's regime, third, and then in the middle is Hippodamus, who's in love with, as you'll see, threeness, threosity. And then you get Carthage, Sparta, and Crete. Plato's Republic is complete equality. No, it's not equality, but it's communal. It is property in some ways equal to everybody, although, as Aristotle points out, it's not clear if this is the case in the lower classes in the Republic, but at least it's communalized property and family. At least property. And the laws, Aristotle says, the laws is closer to human reality and human convention. The family is preserved in the laws, but it's less communalized. In other words, property. And then in Thales you get equalized property. And one of my favorite lines in the because Thales thinks if you equalize property, you solve everything. It's kind of like Marx. Although Marx also wanted to eliminate the private family too, don't forget. And he thought, Marx and Lenin argued, as does modern feminism, much of modern feminism, not difference feminism, by the way, but modern sameness feminism does argue that male-female differences are all, gender identities are all socially constructed. And in fact, Marx and Engels argued that the private family, private eros, grows out of private property. At least Locke thought the other thing, and so does Aristotle in some ways, and Plato, that private property comes out of eros, or is a part of eros, sexualized eros. Marx and Lenin reversed that completely and said, no, gender roles came out of private property, since gender roles are patriarchal in a form of ownership. And you can't have ownership of men. You can't have ownership of females by men if you don't have ownership of private property. That's the Marxist presumption. So anyway, but one of my favorite lines is, so the point is focusing the political on the equalization of property, and in some ways Thales is less radical than Plato in the Republic, Socrates, Plato in the Republican laws, but he makes property central, as if, and this is one of my favorite lines, it says, but nobody becomes a tyrant to get out of the cold, as if equalizing property would solve all the issues of society. And indeed, that is Marx. Equalizing and communizing property means the disappearance of exploitative politics. That really worked out, didn't it, in 2/3 of humanity that were governed by Marxist regimes? Anyway, but then Hippodamus then is this bizarre attachment to threeness. More about that in a minute. And then you have the three somewhat good regimes in practice at the end, on the other side of the teeter-totter, the seesaw, Sparta, Crete, and Carthage. Hippodamus is the central focus here, then, if you arrange the book 2 this way. Showing what happens when weird guys run with their weird ideas. Because the section on Hippodamus is kind of gossipy. You know, he's kind of weird. He didn't change his clothes. But why 3? It's kind of an adumbration or a reference, an allusion perhaps, to Pythagoreanism, where according to Pythagorean number theory, 1 is the unity of all things, but is unmanifest, kind of like Eastern religions with Hinduism and Buddhism, where Brahma well, actually, it's kind of like that, where the Hindu Trinity, Shiva, Vishnu, and Brahma are manifestations of the unmanifest one. But in Pythagorean number theory, 1 is unity but unmanifest and inactive. 2 is the duality where tension involved, and 3 is the triangular 3 is kind of like the resolution of tension and a kind of developed or synthetic and higher form of unity. So Hippodamus is devoted to threeness. So he has 3 classes, 3 this, and I think this is what Aristotle is doing here by this odd discussion. This is his caution to political philosophers, to go back to the beginning of these notes. In other words, Hippodamus is in love with the theoretical 3 and just imposes it on human nature, as if taking this theoretical abstraction of threeness as perfection and imposing it on politics and human society will fix everything in human life. And Aristotle's suggestion is probably not. Well, where does this go? You'll see my last comments for this lecture. So the rest of the book 2 then examines 3 historical or real regimes in practice. Sparta, which is good in some, bad in some, perhaps too pointed in war because they only look to a part of virtue. So Spartans got courage if you saw the 300, and my mother loved it and salivated over all those male bodies. I was so embarrassed when we took her to see that. But no, I'm just kidding. But 300, the Spartans did save a Greek civilization against the Persian threat because of their military virtue. Spartans got courage right, but they didn't seem to get the rest of virtue right or care about it as much. Crete, a little bit better in laws, worse in war. And he says the Cretans didn't need to because they're an island and they were somewhat protected by their oceans. Oh, so much for that when given the Athenian navy. And by the way, note, Athens is not listed in the best in these good regimes in practice. Both Plato and Aristotle demote Athenian democracy. And in fact, as you'll see when we come to the classification of regimes in Book 3, Aristotle says explicitly, democracy is not a good regime. Don't forget, in the Republic, democracy was the regime that gave right before it descended into. So out of anarchy, the excess of democracy, comes the reaction of tyranny, of authoritarianism. So, and Carthage, a bit too oligarchic. So here's my point. These regimes would be better if they were guided by proper theory, if they listened to political philosophers who see human nature more complete. Don't forget, Aristotle's a political philosopher just like Plato and Socrates, and like Cicero. They believe that the human world is made better by the perfection of the rational capacity, and that the benefits of bringing through philosophic exercise, either the dialectic or theoretical contemplation in the ethics and in this, that in bringing the human mind to expanding the power of the human mind to see itself in the universe through philosophy and political philosophy, you improve the capacity of the human race to make their lives better on the ethical, individual level in the ethics. And you've read the ethics, and you can decide if you really put some of those things into practice. My guess is you probably have a better life. I think there's, and by the way, the great Catholic, Muslim, and Jewish, I couldn't remember the name of the third religion, in the medieval ages, Al-Rushd in the Islamic world and Maimonides in the Jewish world and Aquinas, are essentially applications and integrations of Aristotelian ethical and political theory into the Abrahamic traditions in their respective traditions. So my guess is the premise that if you absorbed some of the teaching in the ethics, you probably would lead a better and happier life. You'd certainly probably pick better friends. Anyway, so there you have Book 2. Practice needs to be guided by theory, but theory needs to be grounded in practice. And that's my last comment on Book 2. It seems to me that Aristotle demonstrates that the relationship between philosophy and practical life has to be a mean, as the actual solution in politics in Book 4 is a mean, as I mentioned before, and as you'll see in Books 3 and 4. The real practical improvement of life is a mean between democracy and oligarchy, the two most common regimes in practice. We'll talk about the other regimes too. But in the same way that virtue is a kind of a mean between extremes in the ethics, the proper relationship of philosophy to human life is also a mean. And I'll just repeat it because it's well said. Practice needs to be guided and expanded by theoretical wisdom, theory. But theory, if it becomes detached from practical circumstances and human nature, becomes utopian, abstract, and ultimately destructive of human life. So practice needs to be guided by theory. Theory needs to be grounded in practice. That sounds like a mean to me.